The Ottoman Empire, a name that would echo through centuries, began not with a thunderous declaration, but with the quiet, persistent growth of a small principality in the late 13th century. It was born in the fertile, often turbulent lands of Anatolia, a peninsula that had long served as a bridge between continents, a crossroads of cultures and conflicts. Imagine a landscape where the whispers of ancient empires, Hittite, Phrygian, Lydian, and Roman, still clung to the wind, where Byzantine fortresses stood as silent sentinels, and where the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, though fading, had left a rich tapestry of art and administration. This was the stage upon which the first seeds of Ottoman power were sown. At the heart of this nascent power was a man named Osman I, from whom the empire would derive its very name. He was the leader of a beylik, a small principality, situated on the fringes of the weakening Seljuk domain, specifically in the region of Bithynia, near the strategic Byzantine city of Nicaea. His father, Ertuğrul, had been granted lands in Sogut by the Seljuk Sultan, in recognition of his loyalty and military prowess against the encroaching Mongol hordes. These lands, nestled between the Byzantine Empire to the west and the fragmented Seljuk territories to the east, offered a unique position. It was a frontier, a Ghazi land where warriors for the faith, driven by both spiritual zeal and the promise of plunder, could test their mettle against the Christian Byzantines. Osman inherited this frontier spirit, but he possessed something more, a keen strategic mind and an uncanny ability to attract followers. His early life, shrouded in the mists of oral tradition and later embellished by Ottoman chroniclers, tells of a humble beginning. He was not born into immense wealth or power, but into a community of nomadic Oghuz Turks, whose strength lay in their equestrian skills and their fierce independence. The famous Osman's Dream, a foundational myth, describes him seeing a tree growing from his navel, its branches covering the world, symbolizing the future vastness of his dynasty. While likely a later invention, it speaks to the aspirations and perceived destiny of his emerging state. One of the most crucial early developments was Osman's capture of Karacahisar in 1288, a significant fortress that provided the nascent beylik with a strategic stronghold and a base for further expansion. This wasn't merely a military victory. It marked the establishment of a more permanent administrative center, allowing for the collection of taxes and the organization of a more structured society. This move from a purely nomadic existence to a settled, albeit still expanding, principality was a vital step. Historians still debate the precise nature of Osman's early relationship with the Seljuks. Was he a loyal vassal, or was he already asserting a de facto independence? The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was in its twilight, heavily influenced and eventually absorbed by the Mongol Ilkhanate. This power vacuum, rather than a strong central authority, allowed ambitious beys like Osman to carve out their own spheres of influence. It's perhaps more accurate to see him as opportunistically navigating a complex political landscape, pledging nominal allegiance when convenient, but always with an eye toward consolidating his own power. The early Ottoman successes were not solely due to military might. Osman was also known for his justice and his ability to integrate diverse populations. As his beylik expanded, it absorbed not only other Turkish nomadic groups, but also local Christian populations. Rather than forced conversions, there was often a gradual assimilation facilitated by fair governance and the opportunities offered by a growing, dynamic state. This policy of tolerance, or at least pragmatism, would become a hallmark of early Ottoman rule, attracting disaffected Byzantine peasants and even some minor Byzantine nobles who sought stay. Validity under Ottoman protection. The strategic location of Osman's beylik was paramount. Bithynia, with its fertile plains and proximity to the Sea of Marmara, offered access to vital trade routes and agricultural wealth. More importantly, it bordered the Byzantine Empire, which by the late 13th century was a shadow of its former glory. Constantinople, though still formidable, was isolated, and its Anatolian territories were poorly defended and increasingly neglected. This weakness provided Osman with a constant, tantalizing target for Ghazi raids and eventually systematic conquest. The capture of Bursa in 1326, though occurring shortly after Osman's death and completed by his son Orhan, was the culmination of many years of Ottoman pressure and siege. It was a pivotal moment, transforming the Beylik from a frontier principality into a regional power. Bursa, a rich and important Byzantine city, became the first major Ottoman capital, providing immense resources, a sophisticated urban center, and a symbolic victory over the declining Byzantine authority. This was not a swift, decisive battle, but a prolonged blockade, showcasing the Ottomans' growing patience and logistical capabilities. The early Ottoman leaders, including Osman and his son Orhan, were also adept at institutional innovation. They began to formalize the military, moving beyond mere tribal levies to establish more organized forces. The Ghazi spirit remained, but it was channeled into a more disciplined structure. They also started to develop a rudimentary administration, adapting elements from both Seljuk and Byzantine practices. This adaptability, this willingness to learn and incorporate, was a key factor in their sustained growth. One lesser-known detail from this period is the role of the Ahi brotherhoods. These were Sufi-inspired artisan and trade guilds that held significant social and economic influence in Anatolia. Osman cultivated strong ties with these brotherhoods, particularly with figures like Sheikh Edebali, whose daughter he reportedly married. This alliance provided the nascent Ottoman state with a network of loyal supporters, economic resources, and a moral legitimacy rooted in Islamic piety and communal solidarity. The Ahi provided not just spiritual guidance, but also practical support, helping to organize trade, maintain order, and even recruit fighters for the Ghazi cause. The precise date of Osman's death is another point of scholarly contention, with some sources placing it in 1323 to 24, and others around 1326, coinciding with the fall of Bursa. Regardless of the exact year, his legacy was undeniable. He had taken a small, vulnerable frontier Beylik, and through a combination of military prowess, strategic alliances, and astute leadership, transformed it into a nascent state with a clear trajectory of expansion. He laid the groundwork for an empire that would, for centuries, shape the course of world history, a testament to the vision and resilience of its humble beginnings. The story of the Ottomans is a story of gradual accretion, of patient expansion, and of a remarkable ability to adapt and absorb. From the dusty plains of Ceuta, a seed had been planted, and it was beginning to unfurl its first leaves, reaching tentatively towards the sun. If you're enjoying this, liking and subscribing truly helps and is much appreciated. The gentle whisper of the wind through the olive groves of Bursa carried with it not just the scent of the earth, but the faint murmur of a new era. Orhan, the son of Osman, inherited a nascent emirate, a collection of scattered lands and loyalties, but he possessed a vision far grander than his father's. Where Osman had laid the foundation, Orhan began to build the walls of an empire. His reign, spanning from approximately 1324 to 1362, marked a pivotal transition. He was not merely a tribal chieftain. He was a statesman, a conqueror, and an architect of institutions. One of Orhan's earliest and most significant achievements was the capture of Bursa in 1326. This wasn't just another conquest. It was a strategic masterstroke. Bursa, a city of considerable wealth and cultural significance, became the first true capital of the Ottoman state. Its capture symbolized a shift from nomadic raiding to settled governance. Imagine the bustling markets, the shimmering silks, the calls of merchants echoing through its ancient streets, now under Ottoman dominion. Orhan transformed its churches into mosques, its administrative buildings into centers of his burgeoning power, and its strategic location at the foot of Mount Uladag provided both defense and a gateway to further expansion. The Emirate's growth under Orhan was not solely through military might, though his armies were increasingly formidable. He understood the importance of consolidation and integration. He cultivated relationships with local Byzantine magnates, often through marriage, absorbing their territories and expertise, rather than simply destroying them. This pragmatic approach allowed for a smoother transition of power and a more stable administration. He also began to formalize the military structure, moving beyond the tribal levies that had characterized his father's forces. This laid the groundwork for the highly disciplined and organized army that would become a hallmark of Ottoman power. As Orhan aged, the reins of power began to shift to his sons, most notably Murad I, who ascended to the throne around 1362. Murad, whose reign lasted until 1389, was a force of nature, a brilliant military strategist, and a shrewd administrator. If Orhan had built the walls, Murad began to forge the very soul of the empire, imbuing it with the distinctive characteristics that would define it for centuries. His ambition was boundless, stretching far beyond the Anatolian plateau, aiming squarely at the European mainland. The strategic importance of the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, the narrow straits connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, became paramount. The Ottomans had already established a foothold in Europe during Orhan's time, notably with the capture of Gallipoli in 1354, following a devastating earthquake that had weakened its Byzantine defenses. This was a crucial bridgehead, a launching pad for further conquests. Murad exploited this advantage relentlessly. He pushed westward into Thrace, securing Adrianople, modern Edirne, in 1369, which soon became the new Ottoman capital. This relocation was symbolic, signaling the empire's new focus and its commitment to European expansion. Adrianople, with its fertile plains and strategic location, offered a better base for campaigns against the fragmented Balkan states. It was during Murad's reign that one of the most iconic and enduring institutions of the Ottoman Empire was formally established, the Janissaries. The very name evokes images of discipline, unwavering loyalty, and formidable military prowess. The origin of the Janissaries, meaning new soldier in Turkish, lies in the Devshirme system. This controversial yet incredibly effective system involved the periodic levy of Christian boys from conquered territories, particularly in the Balkans. These boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18, were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and rigorously trained to serve the Sultan directly. They were educated, taught Turkish, and indoctrinated with a fierce loyalty that transcended tribal or regional allegiances. The Devshirme system was a radical departure from traditional military recruitment. It created a standing army, professional and highly disciplined, utterly devoted to the Sultan, and free from the influence of powerful noble families. These young men, often taken from their homes at a tender age, knew no other life than service to the state. They were trained in various arts, from archery and swordsmanship to engineering and administration. The Janissaries became the elite infantry corps, renowned for their discipline, their distinctive white felt caps, and their fearsome effectiveness in battle. They were a military innovation that gave the Ottomans a significant advantage over their less organized European adversaries. Historians still debate the precise timing of the formal establishment of the Janissaries. While the concept of a sultan's personal guard existed earlier, it was under Murad I that they became a distinct, organized, and permanent corps, a professional fighting force that would remain the backbone of the Ottoman army for centuries. Beyond the Janissaries, Murad I also oversaw the development of the Sipahi cavalry, a feudal-like system where land grants, timars, were given in exchange for military service. This provided a decentralized yet effective means of maintaining a large, well-equipped cavalry force across the empire. These two pillars, the professional Janissaries and the feudal Sipahi, formed the core of the Ottoman military machine. Murad's military campaigns were relentless. He systematically brought the various Serbian, Bulgarian, and Byzantine principalities under Ottoman sway. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 stands as a monumental event in this period. It was a decisive victory for the Ottomans against a coalition of Balkan forces led by Prince Lazar of Serbia. The battle, though fiercely contested and resulting in heavy casualties on both sides, effectively sealed the fate of Serbian independence and opened the door for further Ottoman expansion into the Balkans. Tragically, Murad I himself was killed during or immediately after the battle, an event shrouded in some historical ambiguity. Some accounts suggest he was assassinated by a Serbian knight, Miloš Obilić, who feigned surrender to gain access to the Sultan. Others suggest he was killed by a stray arrow or in the chaos of the battlefield. Regardless of the precise circumstances, his death marked the end of an era of incredible expansion. The growing ambition of the Ottomans was palpable. Their horizons were no longer limited to Anatolia. They had crossed into Europe, established new capitals, and developed sophisticated military and administrative institutions. The Byzantine Empire, once the undisputed power in the region, was now a mere shadow of its former self, a beleaguered city-state surrounded by Ottoman territories, its fate seemingly sealed. The Ottomans, once a small frontier emirate, were now a regional superpower, their gaze fixed on Constantinople itself. The administrative structures also evolved under Orhan and Murad. The foundations of the Divan, the imperial council, were laid, bringing together viziers and other high-ranking officials to advise the Sultan and manage the vast territories. The millet system, which allowed religious communities to govern themselves under their own laws, began to take shape. A pragmatic approach to managing a diverse population that would become a defining feature of Ottoman rule. While not fully codified until later, the principles of tolerance and self-governance for non-Muslim communities were already being subtly woven into the fabric of the state. The transformation from a nomadic tribal group to a sophisticated, centralized state was remarkable in its speed. Perhaps the very fluidity of their early structure allowed for this rapid adaptation. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of old, their empires, the Ottomans were able to absorb new ideas, new peoples, and new territories with a surprising degree of flexibility. They were not bound by centuries of tradition, allowing them to innovate and evolve. The whispers of imperial dominance were growing louder, carried on the winds from the Balkans to Anatolia. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the ambition of the Ottoman sultans knew no bounds. From the dusty plains where Osman had first gathered his followers, a mighty empire was rising, its shadow stretching ever wider across the lands, promising both conquest and a new order. The legacy of Orhan and Murad was not just territorial gain, but the creation of a state machine, a military powerhouse, and an administrative framework that would endure for over 6 centuries. Their reigns represent the crucial bridge between a nascent emirate and the formidable empire that would soon challenge the very foundations of the European and Asian worlds. The world held its breath, perhaps unknowingly, as this new power solidified its grip, ready to reshape the geopolitical landscape. The world, it seemed, had been irrevocably altered by the whirlwind of Timur. The year 1402, specifically the summer's end, marked a cataclysm for the burgeoning Ottoman state. On the plains near Ankara, a clash of titans unfolded, one that would echo through the centuries. Sultan Bayezid I, known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for his swift campaigns and decisive victories, found himself facing an adversary of unparalleled military genius and ambition. Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror, had swept across Asia, leaving empires shattered in his wake, and now his gaze, sharp and unblinking, had fallen upon Anatolia. Bayezid, confident in his formidable janissaries and his reputation for invincibility, perhaps underestimated the sheer scale and strategic depth of Timur's forces. The battle itself was a devastating spectacle. Ottoman lines, once so disciplined and unyielding, began to waver under the relentless pressure and the defection of various Anatolian Beylik forces who had been forcibly incorporated into Bayezid's army. These local lords, resentful of Ottoman centralization, saw an opportunity for liberation in Timur's presence. As the sun beat down, turning the dust of the battlefield into a choking haze, the tide turned decisively. Bayezid fought with the ferocity that earned him his moniker, but even a thunderbolt can be quenched. He was captured, a sultan of the Ottomans, a direct descendant of Osman, taken prisoner by a foreign conqueror. The humiliation was profound. The shockwaves reverberated from the Aegean to the Black Sea. This defeat at Ankara was not merely a loss of a battle. It was an amputation, a near-fatal blow to the heart of the Ottoman enterprise. Bayezid would die in captivity the following year, a broken man, and with his passing, the fragile unity he had forged began to unravel. The empire, which had seemed on the cusp of consolidating its vast gains, was plunged into a desperate period known as the Ottoman Interregnum, or the Fetret Devri, the period of chaos. For over a decade, from 1402 to 1413, the very existence of the Ottoman state hung by a thread. Bayezid had left behind several sons, each with legitimate claims to the throne, and each with ambitions fueled by the power vacuum. Isa Çelebi, Musa Çelebi, Mehmet Çelebi, and Süleyman Çelebi, these brothers, once bound by blood, now became bitter rivals, their fraternal bonds severed by the lure of absolute power. Anatolia, only recently brought under Ottoman sway, fractured once more into independent beyliks, many of whom had been restored by Timur himself, deliberately sowing discord to prevent a swift Ottoman resurgence. In the Balkans, the Christian vassals, sensing weakness, began to assert their independence, and the Byzantine Empire, given a reprieve it could scarcely believe, watched with bated breath, hoping for the final collapse of its long-standing adversary. The civil war was brutal and protracted. Cities changed hands multiple times, armies marched and countermarched across the ravaged landscape, and the common people endured immense suffering. The narrative of this period is often dominated by the fierce struggles between the brothers, each vying for supremacy, each forming shifting alliances with internal and external powers. Suleiman, initially holding the European territories, found himself pitted against Musa, who controlled parts of Anatolia and later crossed into Rumelia. Isa attempted to establish himself in Bursa, the former Ottoman capital, only to be driven out. Yet amidst this profound disarray, a remarkable resilience began to manifest. It was not a sudden burst of strength, but a slow, arduous process of reconsolidation, driven by the enduring institutions that Bayezid and his predecessors had established, and by the sheer will of one of his sons. Mehmed Çelebi, often referred to as Mehmed I, emerged as the unlikely savior. He was not the eldest, nor initially the most powerful, but he possessed a unique blend of diplomatic skill, military prowess, and a profound understanding of the delicate balance required to rebuild a shattered state. Mehmed's early struggles were immense. He initially controlled only a small portion of Anatolia, centered around Amasya. He had to contend with the re-emerging Beyliks, the internal treachery of his own family, and the constant threat of Timur's lingering influence. Historians still debate the precise nature of Timur's long-term strategy for Anatolia. Was it merely to cripple the Ottomans, or did he envision a more lasting fragmentation? Whatever his intent, Mehmed defied it. He systematically, patiently, and often ruthlessly eliminated his rivals. His campaigns against his brothers were not merely military victories. They were acts of political consolidation, slowly drawing the fragmented pieces of the empire back together. One lesser-known detail from this period highlights the desperation and ingenuity involved. The Ottomans, even in their weakened state, understood the strategic importance of naval power. During the Interregnum, there were instances of Ottoman forces, even those loyal to different claimants, engaging in limited naval skirmishes in the Aegean, attempting to control vital trade routes and prevent Venetian or Genoese interference. These were not grand fleets, but often hastily assembled vessels, yet they underscore the nascent understanding of maritime strategy that would become crucial in later centuries. By 1413, after a decade of relentless struggle, Mehmed had defeated his last surviving brother, Musa, near Sofia. The long night of the Interregnum was finally over. Mehmed I ascended the throne as the sole sultan, inheriting an empire that was a shadow of its former self, but one that still possessed the fundamental structures and the indomitable spirit that had allowed it to rise in the first place. His reign, though relatively short, was dedicated to healing the wounds of civil war and rebuilding the state from its foundations. He focused on restoring central authority, re-establishing control over the Anatolian beyliks, though often through diplomacy and alliances rather than outright conquest, a testament to his pragmatism, and reasserting Ottoman influence in the Balkans. He understood that the empire's survival depended on internal stability and external recognition. He cultivated diplomatic relations with neighboring powers, including the Mamluks and even Venice, seeking to avoid further costly conflicts while the state recuperated. Perhaps these walls, scarred by a decade of internal strife, whispered stories of resilience to the stars. The recovery was not just a testament to Mehmed I's leadership, but also to the underlying strength of the Ottoman system. The Janissaries, though their loyalty had been tested by the competing claims of the princes, remained a formidable fighting force. The Timar system, which granted land in exchange for military service, provided a framework for economic and military mobilization, even when central authority was weak. The Ottoman administrative apparatus, though battered, had not entirely collapsed. local administrators and religious leaders often continued to function, providing a crucial continuity that prevented total anarchy. The speed of the Ottoman recovery from such a devastating defeat and prolonged civil war is truly remarkable. Within a generation, the empire would not only regain its former strength, but surpass it. This period of interregnum, though marked by chaos and despair, ultimately served as a crucible, forging a stronger, more unified state. It taught the Ottomans invaluable lessons about the dangers of internal division and the importance of a clear line of succession. It also demonstrated the deep roots the Ottoman state had put down in Anatolia and the Balkans, roots that even Timur's devastating blow could not entirely sever. The reign of Mehmed I laid the groundwork for the future glories of the Emp. He was the architect of the Second Ottoman Rise, ensuring that the dream of Osman and Orhan, temporarily shattered at Ankara, would not only endure, but flourish. His efforts ensured that the Ottoman Empire, rather than fading into the annals of history as another ephemeral conquest, would continue its inexorable march, destined to reshape the geopolitical landscape for centuries to come. The scars of the interregnum would remain, a reminder of the fragility of power, but also a testament to the extraordinary capacity for renewal that lay at the heart of the Ottoman spirit. The thunderbolt had been extinguished, but from its ashes, a new, more resilient fire began to glow, promising an even brighter dawn. The air in Edirne, the Ottoman capital, thrummed with a different kind of energy in the mid-15th century. It was an energy born of ambition, of a young sultan's unyielding will. Mehmed II, who ascended to the throne in 1451 at the tender age of 19, was no ordinary ruler. He possessed a sharp intellect, a keen understanding of military strategy, and a vision that stretched far beyond the horizons of his predecessors. From his earliest days, whispers of his singular obsession had circulated through the court. Constantinople, not merely to besiege it, but to conquer it, to make it the very heart of his burgeoning empire. The city, an ancient jewel perched between two continents, had long been a tempting, yet impenetrable prize. Its formidable triple walls, built by Theodosius II in the 5th century, had repelled countless invaders over 1,000 years. Its strategic location, controlling the vital trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, made it a symbol of enduring power and a gateway to immense wealth. For Mehmed, however, it was more than just a city. It was the final gleaming piece in the puzzle of Ottoman dominance, a legacy waiting to be claimed. He began his preparations with meticulous care, demonstrating a foresight remarkable for his age. Recognizing the limitations of traditional siege warfare against such defenses, Mehmed focused on innovation. He commissioned the construction of an enormous cannon, a weapon of unprecedented scale. Cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, this monstrous bronze cannon, known as the Basilica, was capable of firing stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds. Its sheer size and destructive potential were designed to strike fear into the hearts of the defenders, and, more practically, to shatter the ancient walls that had stood for so long. Transporting this behemoth over hundreds of miles of rugged terrain was an engineering marvel in itself, requiring a team of hundreds of oxen and men, painstakingly slow, day by day, towards the besieged city. Beyond the brute force of his artillery, Mehmed also understood the importance of naval supremacy. He ordered the construction of a new fleet, a flotilla of galleys and smaller vessels specifically designed to counter the Byzantine and allied ships that guarded the Golden Horn, Constantinople's crucial inner harbor. This harbor, protected by a massive chain stretched across its mouth, had always been the city's lifeline, allowing resupply and preventing direct naval assault. Mehmed knew he had to overcome this obstacle, or his land forces would remain vulnerable and the siege incomplete. By April 1453, the Ottoman army, numbering perhaps 80,000 to 100,000 men, a truly vast force for the era, stood before the walls of Constantinople. Inside, the city's defenders, led by the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, were a mere shadow of their former glory. They numbered perhaps 7,000 to 10,000, a desperate mix of Byzantine soldiers, Venetian and Genoese mercenaries, and courageous citizens. They knew the odds were stacked against them, yet they prepared for a fight to the bitter end, clinging to the hope that Western aid would arrive, a hope that would, tragically, prove largely futile. The siege began with a relentless bombardment. Day after day, the basilica and other cannons thundered, their concussions shaking the very foundations of the ancient city. The air grew thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Sections of the mighty walls began to crumble, yet the defenders, with incredible resilience, would work tirelessly through the nights, patching the breaches with timber, rubble, and sheer determination. It was a brutal dance between destruction and desperate repair. But Mehmed had a trick up his sleeve, a move that would etch his name into the annals of military ingenuity. Faced with the impenetrable chain across the Golden Horn, he conceived of an audacious plan. He ordered his engineers to construct a massive slipway, a greased wooden track, over the hills of Galata, bypassing the chain entirely. Under the cover of darkness, in a feat that must have seemed impossible to the Byzantines, dozens of his ships were hauled overland, sails unfurled as if sailing on dry land, and launched into the Golden Horn. Imagine the shock, the disbelief, as the defenders awoke one morning to find Ottoman ships floating within their inner harbor, their last bastion of naval defense breached by sheer audacity. This move, a brilliant stroke of strategic genius, effectively cut off the city's sea access and demoralized its already beleaguered inhabitants. Historians still debate the exact scale and speed of this extraordinary maneuver, with some suggesting it was a more gradual process over several nights, rather than a single dramatic event, but its impact on the siege's outcome is undeniable. The siege dragged on for 53 agonizing days. Famine began to gnaw at the city, and hope dwindled with each passing day. On May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched his final all-out assault. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers crashed against the weakened walls. The fighting was fierce, hand-to-hand, a desperate struggle for survival. Emperor Constantine XI, refusing to flee, fought valiantly alongside his men, reportedly dying in the thick of the battle. His body never definitively identified. As dawn broke, the Ottoman banners were raised over the city. Constantinople, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, had fallen. The immediate aftermath was a period of controlled chaos. While there were initial scenes of pillaging, as was customary for victorious armies of the time, Mehmed quickly rode into the city, heading directly to the Hagia Sophia, the magnificent cathedral that had stood for centuries as a symbol of Christian faith. There, he dismounted, declared it a mosque, and offered prayers, symbolically transforming the city's spiritual heart. His entry was not one of wanton destruction, but of calculated appropriation. He saw the city not as something to be destroyed, but as a prize to be rebuilt and transformed, to become the new heart of his empire. Mehmed's vision for Constantinople, which he renamed Istanbul, was grand and far-reaching. he immediately set about repopulating and rebuilding the devastated city. He encouraged people from across his vast empire, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, to settle there, offering incentives and tax breaks. He initiated massive construction projects, including new mosques, markets, baths, and palaces. The Hagia Sophia was preserved and converted, its mosaics plastered over, but its structure maintained, a testament to Mehmed's pragmatism and respect for monumental architecture. The city's ancient infrastructure was repaired, its aqueducts restored, and its trade routes re-established. Within a few decades, Istanbul had not only recovered, but flourished, becoming one of the largest and most vibrant cities in the world, a true crossroads of cultures and commerce. The fall of Constantinople was a watershed moment in world history, marking the definitive end of the Byzantine Empire and, for many historians, the close of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the early modern era. Its strategic implications were profound. For the Ottomans, it secured their position as a dominant power, giving them undisputed control over the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, vital waterways connecting east and west. It provided them with an unparalleled capital, a city that could serve as the administrative, cultural, and economic hub of their rapidly expanding empire. The conquest also solidified their presence in Europe, positioning them as a major force on the continent. For Europe, the shockwaves were immense. The fall of the city, long considered an impregnable bulwark against Eastern expansion, sent a shiver of fear through Christendom. It spurred renewed efforts to find alternative trade routes to the east, bypassing Ottoman control. A factor T. Hat contributed significantly to the age of exploration and the discovery of new sea lanes around Africa and across the Atlantic. The influx of Byzantine scholars and texts from Constantinople to Western Europe also played a role in the burgeoning Renaissance, bringing ancient Greek knowledge to a wider audience. Mehmed II, now known as Fatih, the Conqueror, continued his reign with a series of further military campaigns, expanding the Ottoman Empire into the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Aegean. He was not just a military genius, but also a patron of the arts and sciences, fluent in several languages and deeply interested in philosophy and technology. He established a sophisticated administrative system for his empire, codifying laws and organizing the bureaucracy. His reign laid the foundational structures for the Ottoman Empire's Golden Age, transforming it from a powerful regional state into a vast, multi-ethnic, and enduring imperial power that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. The city he conquered and transformed, Istanbul, remained the heart of this empire, a vibrant testament to his vision, forever echoing the whispers of ancient empires and the thunder of a new dawn. The dawn of the 16th century saw the Ottoman Empire, already vast and formidable, poised on the precipice of its most illustrious era, a period often whispered about as its Golden Age. This was the Age of Suleiman, a name that would echo through history with the epithet the Magnificent in the West and Kanuni, the Lawgiver, in the East. His reign, spanning from 1520 to 1566, was a tapestry woven with threads of unprecedented military might, profound legal reform, and a cultural efflorescence that painted the empire in hues of unparalleled splendor. When Suleiman ascended to the throne, the world was a canvas of shifting powers: the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V, the burgeoning Safavid dynasty in Persia, and the various European monarchies all vied for dominance. But none could truly rival the Ottoman juggernaut. Suleiman, a man of immense intellect and strategic genius, understood this intricate geopolitical dance. His early campaigns were swift and decisive, aimed at consolidating Ottoman control and projecting its power further into Europe and beyond. One of his first major triumphs was the capture of Belgrade in 1521. This strategic fortress, long a thorn in the Ottoman side and a gateway to Central Europe, fell after a fierce siege. Its conquest opened the path to Hungary, and just 5 years later, in 1526, the Battle of Mohacs unfolded on the plains of Hungary. This was a pivotal moment, a crushing Ottoman victory that saw the death of King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, effectively ending Hungarian independence and paving the way for Ottoman rule over much of Hungary for the next 150 years. Imagine the dust rising from the hooves of thousands of cavalry, the glint of sunlight on scimitars, and the thunderous roar of Ottoman cannons, a sound that must have struck fear into the hearts of their adversaries. This victory was not merely a territorial gain. It was a psychological blow to Christian Europe, demonstrating the seemingly unstoppable momentum of the Ottoman war machine. Suleiman's ambitions, however, extended beyond Hungary. In 1529, he launched the first siege of Vienna, the very heart of the Habsburg Empire. Though ultimately unsuccessful in taking the city, the very act of bringing such a massive army to the gates of Vienna sent shivers across the continent. The image of Ottoman tents stretching for miles, their crescent banners fluttering in the wind, must have been a terrifying sight for the city's defenders. This siege, while a military failure, was a powerful statement of intent, showcasing the reach and audacity of Ottoman power. Beyond the battlefields, Suleiman was equally formidable as a statesman and reformer. He recognized that a vast empire required a robust and equitable legal system to ensure stability and justice. He initiated a comprehensive overhaul of the Ottoman legal code, which had grown somewhat fragmented over the centuries. This monumental undertaking involved reviewing and codifying existing laws, as well as introducing new regulations to address contemporary issues. The resulting legal framework, known as the Kanun, or the Book of Laws, covered everything from criminal justice and land tenure to taxation and administrative procedures. It sought to harmonize the secular law, Kanun, with the sacred Islamic law, Sharia, ensuring that justice was administered fairly and consistently across the diverse empire. This commitment to law earned him the moniker Kanuni, the lawgiver, a title that perhaps speaks more to his lasting legacy than even the magnificent. Historians still debate the precise extent to which Suleiman personally authored these laws versus relying on his skilled jurists, but there is no doubt that his reign saw an unprecedented focus on legal reform. The empire under Suleiman was not just a military and legal powerhouse. It was a vibrant center of culture, art, and intellectual pursuits. Constantinople, the imperial capital, blossomed into one of the world's largest and most cosmopolitan cities. Architects, artists, poets, and scholars flocked to the city, drawn by the patronage of the Sultan and his court. The most celebrated figure of this architectural golden age was Mimar Sinan, a genius whose works rivaled those of the greatest architects in history. Sinan, a convert to Islam and a former Janissary, rose through the ranks to become the chief imperial architect, designing hundreds of structures throughout the empire. His masterpieces, such as the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul and the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, are testaments to his unparalleled skill and vision. The Süleymaniye, with its cascading domes and slender minarets, dominates the Istanbul skyline, a serene yet majestic presence overlooking the Golden Horn. Imagine standing beneath its vast dome, the light filtering through stained glass windows, and the hushed echoes of prayers filling the immense space. A truly sublime experience. These structures were not merely buildings. They were symbols of Ottoman power, piety, and artistic sophistication, designed to inspire awe and devotion. Beyond grand mosques, Sinan also designed bridges, aqueducts, schools, hospitals, and caravanserais, all contributing to the empire's infrastructure and public welfare. His work showcased a unique blend of Islamic and Byzantine architectural traditions, creating a distinctive Ottoman style that was both grand and harmonious. The sheer volume and quality of his output are staggering, and his influence shaped Ottoman architecture for centuries to come. The cultural flourishing extended to other arts as well. Miniature painting reached new heights, with intricate details and vibrant colors depicting historical events, court life, and literary scenes. Calligraphy, considered the highest form of Islamic art, was meticulously practiced, transforming religious texts and imperial decrees into breathtaking works of visual beauty. Poetry, particularly in the divan tradition, thrived under Suleiman's patronage, with the Sultan himself being an accomplished poet, writing under the pen name Muhibbi. His verses often explored themes of love, spirituality, and the transient nature of life, offering a glimpse into the inner world of this powerful ruler. The Ottoman court itself was a dazzling spectacle of pomp and ceremony. The Topkapi Palace, the Sultan's primary residence, was a city within a city, housing thousands of people, from the imperial family and high-ranking officials to eunuchs, servants, and artisans. Its courtyards, pavilions, and gardens were meticulously maintained, reflecting the order and grandeur of the empire. The famed harem, a complex world of its own, was home to the Sultan's concubines, wives, and female relatives, a place of intrigue and influence, often misunderstood in Western narratives. One lesser-known detail of the harem during Suleiman's time was the significant influence wielded by Roxolana, or Hurrem Sultan, a former slave girl who rose to become Suleiman's legal wife and a formidable political force, breaking centuries of Ottoman tradition. Her letters and political maneuvering highlight the complex dynamics within the imperial household. Suleiman's reign also saw the Ottoman navy become a dominant force in the Mediterranean. Under the command of legendary admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa, the Ottoman fleet challenged Habsburg and Venetian supremacy, securing control over vital trade routes and extending Ottoman influence across North Africa. The Barbary coast, stretching from Algeria to Tunisia, became firmly integrated into the Ottoman sphere, providing both naval bases and a steady stream of resources. The clash of galleys, the scent of salt and gunpowder on the sea breeze, and the cries of sailors must have been common sounds across the azure waters of the Mediterranean during this period. The empire's vastness brought with it immense wealth, fueled by control over key trade routes connecting East and West. Spices from India, silks from China, and precious metals from Europe flowed through Ottoman lands, enriching the imperial treasury and stimulating economic activity. The bustling bazaars of Istanbul, Aleppo, and Cairo were melting pots of cultures and goods, where merchants from across the known world bartered and traded. Imagine the kaleidoscope of colors, the cacophony of languages, and the exotic aromas of spices and perfumes that filled these vibrant marketplaces. Yet, even in this golden age, the seeds of future challenges were being sown. The sheer size of the empire made administration increasingly complex, and the beginnings of corruption, though minor at this stage, could be discerned. The constant warfare, while yielding victories, also drained resources and manpower. And while Suleiman's legal reforms brought order, the question of succession, always a perilous issue in Ottoman history, continued to loom large. The practice of fratricide, though not always carried out, created an undercurrent of fear and suspicion within the imperial family. Suleiman himself was not immune to this tragic aspect of Ottoman dynastic politics, ordering the execution of his eldest son, Mustafa, due to suspicions of treason, a decision that remains a point of considerable historical debate and sorrow. Was it a necessary act to secure the empire's future, or a tragic misjudgment fueled by court intrigue? Historians continue to grapple with this painful question. As Suleiman's long reign drew to a close in 1566, the empire he left behind was at its zenith. It stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimea to Yemen and North Africa. Its institutions were robust, its culture vibrant, and its military unrivaled. The world looked on, some in awe, others in fear, at the sheer power and magnificence of the Ottoman Empire. His legacy was not just one of conquest, but of profound legal and administrative reform, and an artistic and cultural blossoming that would leave an indelible mark on the landscape and soul of the lands he ruled. Perhaps the very stones of the Suleymaniye, warmed by centuries of sunlight, still whisper stories of the lawgiver, of the golden age when the Ottoman crescent shone brightest across 3 continents. His passing marked the end of an era, but the empire he forged would continue to shape global events for centuries to come, carrying the echoes of his magnificent reign into the future. The Golden Age, though seemingly boundless, carried within its very brilliance the seeds of change, a subtle shift in the currents that had once propelled the empire ever forward. As the echoes of Suleiman's grandeur began to fade, a new rhythm emerged, one of gradual deceleration rather than headlong charge. The sheer immensity of the Ottoman domains, once its greatest strength, now presented an unforeseen challenge. Governing an empire stretching across 3 continents, from the sun-drenched plains of Hungary to the arid deserts of Arabia, from the Fertile Crescent to the distant shores of North Africa, demanded an administrative prowess that was increasingly difficult to sustain. The most immediate and poignant shift occurred within the very heart of the dynasty itself. The succession, after Suleiman the Magnificent, a figure whose presence had cast such a long shadow, proved to be a pivotal moment. His son, Selim II, known often as Selim the Sot or Selim the Drunkard, ascended the throne in 1566. This nickname, while perhaps overly harsh and possibly a later embellishment by those seeking to highlight a perceived decline, certainly painted a picture of a ruler less engaged with the day-to-day rigors of governance than his formidable father. Unlike Suleiman, who had personally led campaigns and meticulously overseen state affairs, Selim preferred the comforts of the palace, leaving much of the practical administration to his grand viziers, particularly Sokalu Mehmed Pasha, a truly brilliant statesman who had served Suleiman as well. This delegation of power, while not inherently negative, marked a departure from the deeply ingrained tradition of the Sultan as the ultimate hands-on ruler and military commander. It set a precedent that future sultans, often less capable than Selim or less fortunate in their choice of viziers, would follow. The sheer weight of imperial responsibility, once borne directly by the monarch, began to diffuse, sometimes into competent hands, but at other times into those less prepared or more self-interested. The once feared Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that had been the backbone of Ottoman military might, also began to undergo a subtle transformation. Their unwavering loyalty and discipline, forged through rigorous training and a unique system of recruitment, began to fray at the edges. By the late 16th century, their ranks were no longer exclusively filled through the Devshirme, the levy of Christian boys. Instead, sons of Janissaries and even other Muslims found ways to enter the corps, often through bribery or influence. This shift diluted their martial purity and their absolute devotion to the Sultan, introducing a more hereditary and less meritocratic element. They began to involve themselves in politics, staging revolts when their demands were not met or when they disapproved of a Grand Vizier. These early rumblings of Janissary insubordination, though often quelled, were a stark contrast to their earlier unwavering obedience and signaled a potential internal challenge to imperial authority. Beyond the palace walls and the barracks, the broader administrative machinery of the empire faced growing strain. The vastness of the empire meant that communication and control from Istanbul to its distant provinces became increasingly challenging. Corruption, an age-old human failing, began to seep into various levels of governance. The system of tax farming, where individuals would bid for the right to collect taxes in a given area, often led to exploitation of the populace as these tax farmers sought to maximize their own profits. This, in turn, could spark local unrest and diminish the central government's revenue. Economically, the world was changing, and the Ottoman Empire, while still immensely wealthy, found itself increasingly less central to the new global trade routes. The age of exploration, which had begun in the 15th century, was now in full swing. European powers, particularly Portugal and Spain, and later England and the Netherlands, were establishing direct sea routes to Asia, bypassing the traditional land and sea routes through the Middle East, which the Ottomans had largely controlled. The vast quantities of silver flowing into Europe from the Americas also had a destabilizing effect, leading to inflation within the Ottoman economy. While the empire still commanded immense resources and controlled vital trade arteries, the shift in global economic gravity was undeniable, a slow, almost imperceptible tilt that would have long-term consequences. The shifting balance of power in Europe also played a significant role in the empire's evolving fortunes. While the Ottomans had long been the dominant military force in the region, their European rivals were rapidly advancing in military technology and organization. The Habsburgs, despite their internal struggles, were consolidating their power and improving their defenses. The rise of new military tactics and technologies, particularly in artillery and musketry, meant that the Ottoman military, while still formidable, could no longer rely solely on its traditional strengths. The long, drawn-out wars with the Habsburgs, particularly in Hungary, became increasingly costly and yielded fewer decisive victories. These conflicts drained the imperial treasury and strained its manpower. Without the vast territorial gains that had characterized earlier campaigns, perhaps one of the more subtle yet significant shifts occurred in the intellectual and cultural spheres. While the Ottoman Empire had been a beacon of learning and artistic achievement for centuries, a certain insularity began to creep in. The vibrant exchange of ideas and technologies that had once characterized the early empire seemed to diminish. European advancements in science, mathematics, and military technology, which were accelerating rapidly during the Renaissance and Reformation periods, were not always fully embraced or integrated into Ottoman society with the same zeal as in earlier eras. Historians still debate the precise reasons for this perceived intellectual stagnation. Was it a conscious choice to preserve tradition, a lack of awareness of European developments, or simply the immense administrative burden of a vast empire leaving less room for intellectual curiosity? The answer likely lies in a complex interplay of these factors. One lesser-known detail from this period illustrates the internal struggles. The Kaifs, or cage system of succession, though not formally instituted until the 17th century, had its roots in this era. Instead of sending potential heirs to govern provinces, where they might gain valuable experience but also potentially challenge the reigning sultan, they were increasingly confined to secluded apartments within the Topkapi Palace. These princes lived lives of luxury, but also isolation and constant fear, as their very existence was a threat to the current sultan. This system, while preventing potential civil wars among brothers, often produced rulers who were ill-prepared for the immense responsibilities of governing an empire, having spent their lives cloistered from the realities of the world. Imagine a young prince, perhaps dreaming of grand campaigns and wise governance, instead spending his days within gilded walls, his only companions eunuchs and concubines, his only view the palace gardens. What kind of ruler could such an upbringing truly produce? The very concept of decline itself is a complex and often debated topic among historians. Was it a precipitous fall, or a slow, almost imperceptible evolution? Many scholars now argue against the idea of a sudden decline immediately after Suleiman, preferring to see this period as one of transformation and adaptation. Albeit with growing challenges, the empire remained a formidable power for centuries to come, capable of launching significant military campaigns and maintaining its vast territories. Yet, the foundations laid in the 16th century, the subtle shifts in governance, military structure, economic standing, and intellectual engagement undeniably set the stage for the challenges that would become more pronounced in the centuries that followed. The Ottoman Empire, like any vast and complex entity, was a living organism, constantly evolving. The high tide of its power and influence reached under Suleiman began to recede, not in a sudden crash, but in a gradual ebbing. The waters, though still deep and powerful, no longer reached as far. The distant shores, once easily claimed, now required greater effort, greater resources, and faced increasingly formidable resistance. The empire was not yet in peril, but the golden glow of its zenith had begun to soften, replaced by the more muted tones of maturity, and with it, the quiet hum of growing pains. The world was changing, and the empire, once the undisputed master of its destiny, now found itself increasingly reacting to external forces rather than solely dictating its own path. The whispers of the wind carried not just the tales of past glories, but also the faint, distant echoes of a new, more challenging era. The grand procession of Ottoman power, once seemingly boundless, began to slow, then falter, as the 17th century unfolded. The vibrant tapestry woven with threads of conquest and cultural flourishing started to fray at its edges. The empire, which had for so long been defined by its expansion, now found itself in a new, uncomfortable posture, one of defense and increasingly of internal struggle. The sheer momentum that had carried it across continents began to wane, replaced by a period often characterized by stagnation, punctuated by desperate and frequently unsuccessful attempts at reform. One of the most visible signs of this shifting tide was in the military realm. The Janissaries, once the elite vanguard of Ottoman might, began to lose their formidable edge. Their discipline, once legendary, eroded as they became increasingly involved in political intrigues and economic pursuits, even engaging in trade and crafts. By the early 17th century, their numbers swelled far beyond their original purpose, and their loyalty shifted from the Sultan to their own corporate interests. This transformation meant that the very weapon that had forged the empire now often turned inward, becoming a source of instability rather than strength. For instance, the assassination of Sultan Osman II in 1622 by rebellious Janissaries and other elements of the military establishment stands as a stark testament to their unchecked power and the precariousness of the Sultan's position. This act, unthinkable in earlier centuries, signaled a profound shift in the balance of power within the imperial structure. Beyond the Janissaries, the broader Ottoman military faced new challenges on the battlefield. European armies, particularly those of the Habsburgs and the rising powers of Russia and Poland-Lithuania, were rapidly modernizing. They adopted new tactics, improved their artillery, and developed more disciplined infantry formations. The Ottomans, reliant on traditional methods that had served them well for centuries, found themselves increasingly outmatched. The long, drawn-out wars against the Habsburgs, such as the Ottoman-Habsburg War of 1663 to 1664, culminating in the Battle of St. Gotthard, though not a complete rout, demonstrated the growing parity and even superiority of European forces. The empire, once accustomed to dictating terms, now found itself fighting for survival on multiple fronts. The economic foundations of the empire also began to show cracks. The influx of silver from the Americas into Europe, often referred to as the price revolution, caused significant inflation within the Ottoman Empire, just as it did across the globe. This inflation devalued the Ottoman currency and disrupted traditional economic systems. The empire's reliance on land-based trade routes also faced new competition as European powers developed direct maritime trade routes to Asia, bypassing the traditional Ottoman intermediaries. The once bustling Silk Road, though still active, saw its prominence diminish. The system of Timar, where land was granted in exchange for military service, also began to break down. Instead, many lands were converted into malikane, or lifetime tax farms, which were auctioned off to the highest bidder. While this brought immediate revenue to the state, it often led to exploitation of the peasantry and a decline in agricultural productivity, as the tax farmers had little incentive for long-term investment in the land. In the face of these mounting challenges, various sultans and grand viziers recognized the urgent need for change. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a series of reform efforts, often initiated by strong figures who understood the gravity of the situation. One of the most notable early reformers was Sultan Murad IV, who reigned from 1623 to 1640. He was a stern and often ruthless ruler who sought to restore order and discipline. He famously cracked down on corruption, curbed the power of the Janissaries, and even attempted to enforce moral codes, such as banning coffeehouses and tobacco, which he viewed as sources of sedition and idleness. While his reforms brought a temporary resurgence of imperial authority and military success, such as the recapture of Baghdad in 1638, they were largely personalistic and did not address the deeper systemic issues plaguing the empire. His reforms often relied on brute force and did not outlive his reign. Later in the 17th century, the Koprulu family of Grand Viziers emerged as a powerful force for reform. Mehmet Koprulu, appointed Grand Vizier in 1656, was given unprecedented authority by the Sultan. He, along with his son Fazil Ahmed Koprulu, instituted a series of reforms aimed at restoring military discipline, curbing corruption, and stabilizing the economy. They purged corrupt officials, reformed the tax system, and even launched new military campaigns that saw some success, such as the conquest of Crete from the Venetians in 1669 after a grueling 24-year siege. Their efforts brought a period of relative stability and even a brief resurgence of military prowess. But even their strong hand could not fundamentally alter the trajectory of decline. The empire's underlying structural weaknesses remained. The 18th century brought even greater pressure. The Great Turkish War, 1683 to 1699, sparked by the Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna in 1683, proved to be a watershed moment. This ambitious campaign, led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, ended in a devastating defeat for the Ottomans at the gates of Vienna. The subsequent war saw the formation of the Holy League, an alliance of European powers including Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia. The Ottomans suffered a series of crushing defeats, most notably at the Battle of Zenta in 1697, where Prince Eugene of Savoy inflicted a decisive blow. The war concluded with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, a truly humiliating peace for the Ottomans. For the first time, the empire was forced to cede vast territories in Europe, including Hungary and Transylvania to the Habsburgs, Podolia to Poland, and parts of Dalmatia to Venice. This treaty marked a definitive end to Ottoman expansion in Europe and initiated a long period of territorial retreat. It also shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility, both in the eyes of Europe and within the empire itself. The shock of Karlowitz spurred new, more earnest attempts at reform, often looking to Europe for inspiration. This era is sometimes referred to as the Tulip period, 1718 to 1730. Named for the Ottoman elite's fascination with Dutch tulips and European culture. During this time, under the patronage of Sultan Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, there was a conscious effort to adopt certain aspects of European innovation, particularly in military technology and architecture. Embassies were sent to European capitals like Paris and Vienna, not just for diplomatic purposes, but to observe and learn. The first Ottoman printing press, though initially resisted by religious scholars, was finally established in 1727 by Ibrahim Mutafarrika, a Hungarian convert to Islam. This was a significant step, as it allowed for the printing of secular books, maps, and scientific texts, though religious texts continued to be copied by hand. However, this period of cultural opening and reform was fragile. It was perceived by some as an abandonment of traditional Ottoman values, and was ultimately brought to an abrupt end by a Janissary revolt in 1730, the Patrona Halil Rebellion, which overthrew Ahmed III and executed Ibrahim Pasha. This rebellion underscored the deep resistance to reform from conservative elements within the empire, particularly those who felt their privileges or way of life were threatened. Historians still debate the precise reasons for the Ottoman Empire's relative stagnation compared to the rapid advancements in Europe during this period. Was it an inherent flaw in the Ottoman system? Perhaps its centralized nature, or its reliance on a slave-based military? Or was it simply a matter of scale, the sheer inertia of such a vast and diverse empire, making rapid adaptation difficult? Some scholars point to the lack of a strong mercantile class akin to those in Europe, or the absence of a scientific revolution that could drive technological innovation. Others suggest that the empire's early successes actually hindered its ability to adapt, fostering a sense of complacency and superiority that made it resistant to learning from perceived inferiors. Perhaps the very self-sufficiency that had once been a strength, allowing the empire to produce most of what it needed internally, became a weakness as it limited exposure to external ideas and competitive pressures. The latter half of the 18th century saw continued military setbacks, particularly in conflicts with Russia. Catherine the Great's Russia emerged as a formidable adversary, steadily pushing south and west, encroaching on Ottoman territories in the Crimea and along the Black Sea. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca in 1774, following another devastating war with Russia, was another profound blow. It granted Russia significant concessions, including the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, a clause that would be repeatedly invoked to interfere in Ottoman internal affairs. It also gave Russia access to the Black Sea and the right of passage through the straits for its merchant ships, chipping away at Ottoman control over these vital waterways. The loss of Crimea, a strategically important region with a significant Tatar population, was particularly painful, marking the first time a Muslim territory was ceded to a Christian power. These repeated defeats and territorial losses created a growing sense of urgency among some Ottoman leaders. Sultan Selim III, who ascended to the throne in 1789, was perhaps the most determined reformer of this era. He recognized that the empire's survival depended on a fundamental overhaul of its military and administrative structures. He embarked on what became known as the Nizami Jadid, or the New Order. This ambitious program aimed to create a modern European-style army, trained and equipped according to contemporary standards. He established new military schools, invited European military instructors, and created new branches of the army, separate from the traditional janissaries. He also attempted to reform the tax system and centralize state authority. However, like previous attempts, Selim III's reforms met fierce resistance from entrenched interests, particularly the janissaries, who saw their privileges and power threatened. They viewed the new army as a direct challenge to their existence and the reforms as an affront to Islamic tradition. The resistance culminated in the 1807 Janissary Revolt, which once again brought down a reforming sultan. Selim III was deposed and later murdered. This tragic end to his earnest efforts highlighted the profound internal obstacles to reform. The empire was caught in a vicious cycle. It needed to modernize to survive, but the very forces that had once been its pillars of strength, the janissaries, the conservative religious establishment, and various provincial power brokers, were now the primary impediments to change. The whispers of the past, the echoes of a glorious age of conquest, seemed to mock the present struggles. The empire, once a single, unified force, now felt like a collection of disparate interests, pulling in different directions. The grandeur of Topkapi Palace, though still magnificent, now seemed to shelter a court grappling with the grim realities of a shrinking empire and a world that had moved on, leaving it to ponder its own twilight. The whispers of change grew louder still, carried on the winds from distant European capitals, across the shimmering Mediterranean, and into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The early 19th century had been a period of profound introspection and, at times, desperate measures. Sultan Selim III's earnest attempts at reform had been tragically cut short, a stark reminder of the deep-seated resistance to change within the Janissary corps and parts of the ulama. Yet, the necessity for transformation only intensified. The empire, once a formidable colossus, now found itself increasingly outmaneuvered, both militarily and economically, by the burgeoning powers of the West. It was a time of painful realization. To survive, the Ottomans had to adapt, and adaptation, it seemed, meant looking outward. The stage was set for a new era of reform, one that would be far more comprehensive and enduring than anything seen before. This period, known as the Tanzimat, or reorganization, truly began to take shape in the 1830s, though its roots stretched back to the reign of Mahmud II, a sultan often overshadowed by his more famous successors, yet whose iron will laid much of the groundwork. Mahmud II, unlike Selim, understood that radical change required radical action. He saw the Janissaries not merely as an obstacle to reform, but as a cancerous growth on the empire's body. In 1826, in an event chillingly known as the Auspicious Incident, Mahmud II orchestrated their final, brutal demise. Cannons roared in Istanbul, turning their barracks into rubble and ending a centuries-old institution that had once been the empire's elite fighting force, but had long since devolved into a self-serving, corrupt, and reactionary force. With the Janissaries gone, the path was cleared for the creation of a modern, European-style army trained by Prussian and French instructors. This act, decisive and ruthless, signaled a new resolve from the imperial center. Mahmud II's reforms extended beyond the military. He abolished the old feudal land tenure system, Timar, began to centralize tax collection, and even introduced a more European style of dress for court officials, replacing turbans with the fez, a symbol, however small, of a shift in outward appearance and perhaps a subtle nod to Western modernity. He established new government ministries, laying the bureaucratic foundations for a more centralized state. Yet, it was under his sons and successors, Abdulmajid I and Abdulaziz, that the Tanzimat truly blossomed, transforming from military and administrative adjustments into a sweeping program of societal restructuring. The Tanzimat reforms were not a sudden burst of activity, but a gradual, evolving process, often driven by the need to respond to internal pressures and external threats. Their overarching goal was to strengthen the Ottoman state by modernizing its institutions, centralizing its authority, and integrating its diverse populations more effectively. The guiding principle was often to create a more efficient, equitable, and ultimately more loyal citizenry, inspired by concepts of citizenship and equality that were gaining traction in Europe. A pivotal moment arrived in 1839 with the promulgation of the Hatta Sharif of Gulhane, the Imperial Edict of Gulhane. This landmark decree, read aloud in the presence of foreign ambassadors and Ottoman dignitaries in the Rose Garden of Topkapi Palace, was a bold declaration of intent. It promised fundamental reforms, security of life, honor, and property for all subjects, regardless of religion, a regular system of taxation, and a fair system of conscription into the army. It was a radical departure from traditional Ottoman governance, which had often treated non-Muslims as second-class citizens, albeit with protected rights under the millet system. The Gulhane Edict was, in essence, a constitutional promise, signaling a move towards the rule of law rather than arbitrary rule. The architects of the Tanzimat were often highly educated, Western-leaning statesmen, many of whom had studied in Europe or had extensive diplomatic experience. Figures like Mustafa Rashid Pasha, Ali Pasha, and Fuad Pasha became the driving forces behind these reforms, navigating the complex currents of court politics and international diplomacy. These men genuinely believed that the empire's salvation lay in adopting the administrative and legal frameworks of Europe, not out of a desire to abandon their own heritage, but to strengthen it against external encroachment. The reforms touched almost every aspect of life. In education, new secular schools were established alongside the traditional madrasas, teaching subjects like mathematics, science, and foreign languages. The Imperial School of Military Sciences and the Imperial Medical School were founded, aiming to produce a new generation of professionals equipped with modern knowledge. There was even an attempt to establish a university, though this proved more challenging and took longer to materialize. The goal was to create an educated elite loyal to the state and capable of managing its modernized institutions. Legal reforms were equally profound. The Tanzimat era saw the introduction of new commercial and criminal codes, largely based on French models, which applied to all subjects, regardless of their religious affiliation. This was a significant step towards legal equality and a departure from the traditional Sharia courts, which continued to operate for family law and religious matters. Mixed courts were established to handle cases involving both Muslims and non-Muslims, further blurring the lines of the old millet system. This legal transformation was not without its complexities. Historians still debate the extent to which these new codes truly superseded traditional Islamic law, or simply coexisted with it, often creating a dual legal system that could be confusing and, at times, contradictory. The Ottoman Empire also began to integrate itself more deeply into the global economy. New banks were established, and foreign investment, particularly from Britain and France, flowed into infrastructure projects like railways and telegraph lines. The Ottoman Bank, founded in 1856, played a crucial role in managing the empire's finances and facilitating trade. These economic ties, while bringing much-needed capital and technology, also increased the empire's financial dependence on European powers, a dependence that would ultimately prove to be a heavy burden. Communication and transportation were revolutionized. The telegraph arrived in the 1850s, connecting Istanbul to the furthest corners of the empire and to Europe, allowing for faster dissemination of information and more centralized control. Railways began to crisscross Anatolia and the Balkans, though their construction was slow and often financed by foreign loans. These developments were not just about efficiency, they were about knitting together a vast, diverse empire, making it feel more like a cohesive whole. Perhaps one of the most ambitious and controversial aspects of the Tanzimat was the attempt to foster a new sense of Ottoman identity, transcending religious and ethnic divisions. The 1856 Reform Edict, known as the Hati Humayun, reiterated and expanded upon the promises of Gulhane, explicitly guaranteeing equal rights and opportunities for all subjects, including non-Muslims. It abolished the jizya, poll tax, traditionally levied on non-Muslims, and allowed them to serve in the military. The idea was to create an Ottoman nation, Osmanluluk, where loyalty to the state superseded communal affiliations. This was a radical concept in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, and its implementation faced significant resistance from both conservative Muslims who felt their traditional supremacy was being eroded, and from non-Muslim communities who, while welcoming equal rights, often harbored growing nationalist aspirations of their own. 1. Lull. Lesser-known detail of the Tanzimat era is the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA, in 1881. This institution, though technically created after the main Tanzimat period, was a direct consequence of the empire's spiraling foreign debt, much of which was incurred to finance the very reforms and infrastructure projects of the Tanzimat. The OPDA was effectively an international financial control body, managed by European creditors, which collected a significant portion of the Ottoman Empire's revenues directly from various state monopolies and taxes to repay its debts. It was a stark symbol of the empire's loss of financial sovereignty and a painful reminder of the unintended consequences of rapid modernization without sufficient economic planning. The Tanzimat reforms, despite their noble intentions and significant achievements, faced immense challenges. Resistance came from various quarters. Conservative religious scholars who viewed the reforms as an abandonment of Islamic principles, bureaucrats who feared losing their traditional privileges, and even some segments of the population who simply preferred the old ways. The sheer scale of the empire, its vast geography, and its diverse populations made uniform implementation incredibly difficult. Local notables and provincial governors often resisted central control, and the concept of universal citizenship struggled to take root in communities deeply entrenched in their traditional identities. Moreover, the international context was relentlessly unfavorable. European powers, while often encouraging Ottoman reform, simultaneously pursued their own strategic interests, which often involved supporting nationalist movements within the empire or carving out spheres of influence. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, fought against Russia with the support of Britain and France, highlighted the empire's continued military vulnerability, even after reforms. The war also deepened its financial dependence on European loans. By the 1870s, the momentum of the Tanzimat began to wane. The empire was still plagued by financial crises, internal unrest, and external pressures. The Balkan provinces were simmering with nationalist revolts, often supported by Russia. The reign of Abdulaziz, who succeeded Abdulmajid I, saw a continuation of reforms, but also increasing extravagance and financial mismanagement, culminating in his deposition in 1876. His successor, Murad V, reigned for only a few months before being replaced by Abdulhamid II, whose reign would mark a significant shift in imperial policy. The legacy of the Tanzimat is complex and enduring. It laid the foundations for a modern Turkish state, introducing concepts of constitutionalism, secular education, and a centralized bureaucracy that would be further developed in the 20th century. It fostered a new generation of educated elites who were familiar with Western ideas and institutions. Yet, it also inadvertently contributed to the rise of nationalism within the empire, as the very concept of equality and citizenship encouraged different groups to define themselves against, rather than within, the Ottoman whole. The reforms, while aiming to strengthen the empire, also exposed its weaknesses and vulnerabilities, making it more susceptible to foreign intervention and ultimately accelerating its decline. Perhaps these grand reforms, meticulously planned and earnestly executed, were a desperate race against time, a valiant effort to mend a sprawling ancient tapestry with threads spun in a new, unfamiliar world. The sultans and statesmen of the Tanzimat era, looking out from their palaces on the Bosphorus, must have felt the immense weight of history and the urgent pull of the future, striving to navigate a path that would preserve their empire in a world that was rapidly leaving old empires behind. The seeds they planted, however, would eventually bloom into something new, something that was both a continuation and a radia. Departure from the Ottoman past. The twilight of an empire, even one as vast and enduring as the Ottoman, rarely descends suddenly. Instead, it often arrives as a series of tremors, growing in intensity until the very foundations begin to crack. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th dawned, the Ottoman Empire, once a colossus bestriding 3 continents, found itself increasingly vulnerable. Its vast territories, a patchwork of restive populations, and its central authority in Istanbul struggling to maintain control. The seeds of nationalism, sown across Europe in the preceding centuries, had finally taken root within the empire's diverse tapestry, blossoming into movements that sought self-determination and independence. Armenians in the east, Arabs in the south, and various Balkan peoples who had not yet broken free all began to articulate their distinct identities and aspirations. This internal ferment was exacerbated by external pressures. The great powers of Europe, Britain, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany, eyed the weakening empire with a mixture of predatory interest and strategic concern. They jostled for influence, carving out spheres of economic control and supporting various nationalist factions, often to their own advantage. The Ottoman state, often dubbed the sick man of Europe, found itself caught in a geopolitical vice, its every move scrutinized, its every weakness exploited. Amidst this growing unrest, a new force emerged from within the empire's own educated elite, the Young Turks. This was not a monolithic movement, but rather a broad coalition of reform-minded individuals, primarily military officers, intellectuals, and civil servants, many of whom had been educated in Europe and were deeply influenced by Western ideas of constitutionalism, progress, and nationalism. They believed that the empire's salvation lay not in clinging to outdated autocratic rule, but in radical modernization and the adoption of a constitutional government. Their discontent simmered during the long and often repressive reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who, despite initiating some reforms in education and infrastructure, maintained a tight grip on power, fearing any challenge to his authority. The Young Turks moment arrived in 1908, a widespread revolt, primarily initiated by army officers in Macedonia, forced Abdul Hamid II to restore the long-suspended Ottoman constitution of 1876 and recall the parliament. This event, known as the Young Turk Revolution, was met with widespread jubilation across the empire. It promised a new era of freedom, equality, and progress, a chance for the diverse peoples of the empire to participate in its governance. For a brief period, Greeks, Armenians, Turks, and Arabs celebrated together, hopeful that a shared Ottoman identity based on constitutional principles could transcend ethnic divisions. However, this initial euphoria soon gave way to the harsh realities of power and the complex interplay of identities. The Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, the most influential faction within the Young Turk movement, gradually consolidated its power. While initially advocating for Ottomanism, a concept of a unified Ottoman identity encompassing all its peoples, their ideology began to shift towards a more Turcocentric nationalism, particularly after the Balkan Wars. This subtle but significant change would have profound and tragic consequences. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 were a devastating blow to the empire. A coalition of Balkan states, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, launched a coordinated attack, swiftly overwhelming Ottoman forces and seizing nearly all of the empire's remaining European territories, including Macedonia and Albania. The loss of these ancestral lands, home to centuries of Ottoman presence, was a profound shock, shattering any lingering illusions of the empire's military might and territorial integrity. The influx of hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees from the Balkans, fleeing persecution and ethnic cleansing, further fueled nationalist sentiments within the CUP, hardening their resolve and leading them to believe that only a strong, centralized, and ethnically defined state could survive. It was against this backdrop of internal turmoil, external pressure, and shifting ideologies that the Ottoman Empire stumbled into the First World War. When war erupted in Europe in August 1914, the CUP leadership, particularly the triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal Pasha, saw an opportunity. They viewed Germany, a rising industrial and military power, as a natural ally capable of helping the empire modernize its army and reclaim lost territories, particularly from Russia. Despite some internal opposition and a desire for neutrality among certain factions, the CUP secretly negotiated an alliance with Germany. The Ottoman Empire formally entered the war in October 1914 after two German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, which had been pursued by the British Navy, entered the Dardanelles and were ostensibly sold to the Ottoman Navy, then proceeded to bombard Russian ports in the Black Sea. The decision to join the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, proved to be a catastrophic gamble. The empire was ill-prepared for a global conflict. Its economy was weak, its infrastructure underdeveloped, and its army, though undergoing modernization, lacked the resources and training to fight on multiple fronts. Yet fight it did. The Ottoman Empire became a vital, if often overlooked, theater of war. It fought Russia in the Caucasus, Britain and France in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and the Levant, Syria, Palestine, and the Allies at Gallipoli, a legendary defensive victory that showcased the tenacity of the Ottoman soldier, but came at an immense human cost. The war years were marked by immense suffering and upheaval. The empire's long-standing multi-ethnic fabric began to unravel under the extreme pressures of total war and the increasingly radicalized ideology of the CUP. One of the darkest chapters of this period was the systematic deportation and mass killing of Armenians, beginning in 1915. While the Ottoman government cited concerns about Armenian disloyalty and collaboration with Russia during the war, particularly in the eastern provinces, the scale and organized nature of the atrocities, which involved forced marches into the Syrian desert, starvation, and massacres, led to the deaths of an estimated 1.5 million Armenians. This event remains a deeply contested and painful historical issue, with Turkey acknowledging widespread deaths, but disputing the term genocide, while numerous international bodies and historians affirm it as such. The scholarly dispute over the nature and intent behind these events continues to this day, with differing interpretations of archival evidence and witness testimonies. As the war dragged on, the empire's resources dwindled, and its people endured immense hardship. Famine, disease, and military casualties took a devastating toll. The Arab Revolt, instigated and supported by the British, most famously by T.E. Lawrence, further weakened Ottoman control in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. By 1918, with Germany facing defeat on the Western Front, the Ottoman Empire was on the brink of collapse. Its armies were exhausted, its territories occupied, and its people desperate for peace. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending its involvement in World War I. The terms were harsh, allowing the Allies to occupy strategic points and demobilize the Ottoman army. Sultan Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman sultan, remained on the throne, but his authority was a mere shadow. The empire, which had endured for over 6 centuries, was now occupied and dismembered by the victorious Allied powers. British, French, Italian, and Greek forces carved out zones of influence and occupation, with plans for a permanent division of Anatolia and the Arab provinces. The final, irreversible fragmentation of Ottoman territories was codified by the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. This treaty was a death knell for the empire, reducing it to a small state in central Anatolia, while granting vast territories to Greece, creating an independent Armenia, and placing the Arab lands under British and French mandates. The treaty was so humiliating and punitive that it sparked a fierce nationalist reaction within Anatolia, leading to the Turkish War of Independence. This war, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a brilliant Ottoman general who had distinguished himself at Gallipoli, rallied the Turkish people against the Allied occupation and the Sultan's collaborationist government. The Turkish War of Independence, fought from 1919 to 1922, was a remarkable struggle for self-determination. Against overwhelming odds, Ataturk and his forces defeated the invading Greek armies, expelled the occupying Allied forces, and ultimately abolished the Ottoman Sultanate on November 1, 1922. The Sultanate, an institution that had defined the empire for over 600 years, vanished into history. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, departed Istanbul on a British warship, his reign ending not with a bang, but a quiet silence. Almost mournful farewell. The Caliphate, a religious title held by the Ottoman sultans since the 16th century, was abolished 2 years later, in 1924, marking the complete secularization of the new Turkish state. The Ottoman Empire, once a beacon of power and culture, had finally succumbed to the forces of nationalism, internal decay, and global conflict. Its vast legacy, however, did not simply disappear. The independent nations that emerged from its ruins, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and numerous Balkan states, all bear the indelible marks of centuries of Ottoman rule in their architecture, cuisine, legal systems, and cultural practices. The story of its decline and fall is a complex tapestry woven with threads of ambition, betrayal, resilience, and tragedy. Perhaps the walls of Topkapi Palace, silent witnesses to centuries of imperial drama, still whisper tales of sultans and viziers, of triumphs and defeats, echoing the final, fading heartbeat of a once mighty dominion. The end of the empire was not an empty void, but a fertile ground from which new nations, new identities, and new struggles would emerge, forever shaping the modern Middle East and beyond. The early 20th century dawned upon the Ottoman Empire with a chilling wind of change, not unlike the biting gales that swept across the Anatolian plains in winter. The Balkan Wars, fought between 1912 and 1913, had been a particularly brutal blow, stripping away almost all remaining Ottoman territories in Europe, save for a sliver of Thrace. The empire, once a formidable presence stretching deep into the continent, now found its European holdings reduced to a mere fraction of their former glory. This rapid contraction, coupled with the rising tide of nationalism within its diverse populace, created an atmosphere of profound instability. The Young Turk movement, which had seized control in 1908, initially promised reform and modernization, but their policies often exacerbated ethnic tensions, pushing non-Turkish groups further away. As the Great War, later known as World War I, erupted in the summer of 1914, the Ottoman Empire found itself at a perilous crossroads. Despite initial declarations of neutrality, the empire, swayed by a pro-German faction within the Young Turk leadership, ultimately cast its lot with the Central Powers. This decision, driven by a complex mix of strategic calculations, a desire to reclaim lost territories, and a deep-seated distrust of the Allied powers, would prove to be a catastrophic gamble. The Ottoman entry into the war opened new fronts, from the deserts of Mesopotamia and the Levant to the rugged terrain of the Caucasus. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 to 1916, where Allied forces attempted to seize the Dardanelles and capture Constantinople, stands as a testament to the empire's resilient, though ultimately doomed, defense. Despite inflicting heavy casualties on the Allied invaders and successfully repelling their assault, the war efforts stretched the empire's already strained resources to their breaking point. The war years were marked by immense suffering and upheaval across the empire. Economic hardship deepened, food shortages became widespread, and disease ravaged populations already weakened by conflict. The empire's vast and diverse territories became battlegrounds, enduring campaigns that saw cities destroyed and ancient landscapes scarred. By 1918, with the Central Powers facing inevitable defeat, the Ottoman Empire was exhausted. Its armies were depleted, its infrastructure shattered, and its treasury empty. The Mudros Armistice, signed on October 30, 1918, effectively ended the Ottoman involvement in the war, signaling the empire's surrender and the beginning of its final chapter. The terms of the armistice were harsh, allowing the Allied powers to occupy strategic points and control communications, effectively dismantling the empire's sovereignty. The immediate aftermath of the armistice saw Allied forces occupying Constantinople, the heart of the empire, and other key regions. This occupation, deeply humiliating for the Ottoman people, ignited a powerful wave of resistance. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a distinguished military commander who had risen to prominence during the Gallipoli campaign, emerged as the leading figure of this nascent Turkish nationalist movement. He rallied forces in Anatolia, far from the occupied capital, laying the groundwork for a new independent state. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920, was a further attempt by the Allied powers to carve up the remaining Ottoman territories, proposing an independent Armenia, an autonomous Kurdistan, and significant territorial concessions to Greece and Italy. However, this treaty was never ratified by the Ottoman parliament and was vehemently rejected by the Turkish nationalists, who viewed it as an unacceptable assault on their sovereignty. The Turkish War of Independence, fought between 1919 and 1922, was a desperate struggle against the forces seeking to dismember Anatolia. Under Mustafa Kemal's leadership, the Turkish nationalists fought fiercely against Greek forces in the west, French forces in the south, and Armenian forces in the east. The decisive victory against the Greek army in the Battle of Dumla Pınar in August 1922 effectively ended the war and secured the territorial integrity of the future Turkish state. This triumph, achieved against overwhelming odds, solidified Mustafa Kemal's position as the liberator and founder of modern Turkey. With the war won, the path was clear for the formal abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate. On November 1, 1922, the Grand National Assembly, convened by Mustafa Kemal in Ankara, passed a resolution formally abolishing the Sultanate, effectively ending 623 years of Ottoman rule. Sultan Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman Sultan, departed Constantinople aboard a British warship a few weeks later, marking a quiet, almost understated end to a dynasty that had once commanded an empire spanning continents. The Caliphate, however, remained for a short while longer, a symbolic vestige of the empire's religious authority, but it too was abolished by the Grand National Assembly on March 3, 1924, transferring its powers to the Assembly. This final act completed the transformation from empire to republic. The establishment of the Republic of Turkey on October 29, 1923, with Ankara as its capital and Mustafa Kemal as its first president, marked a radical departure from the imperial past. The new republic embarked on a sweeping program of modernization and westernization, known as the Ataturk reforms. These reforms aimed to transform Turkish society from its Ottoman and Islamic roots into a secular, modern nation-state. The Latin alphabet replaced the Arabic script. Traditional fez hats were outlawed in favor of Western headwear, and civil law codes replaced religious ones. Women were granted equal rights in many spheres, including the right to vote and hold office, long before many Western nations. These profound changes sought to erase the vestiges of the Ottoman past and forge a new national identity, though the legacy of the empire continued to subtly shape the contours of the new republic. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire left a complex and enduring legacy across 3 continents. In the Middle East, the former Ottoman territories were largely divided into mandates under British and French control, leading to the creation of new states like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. The arbitrary drawing of borders by European powers often disregarding existing ethnic and sectarian divisions, sowed the seeds for many of the conflicts and political instabilities that would plague the region for decades to come. The rise of Arab nationalism, which had been simmering under Ottoman rule, intensified in the post-imperial era, leading to struggles for independence and self-determination. In the Balkans, the collapse of Ottoman authority had already led to the emergence of independent nation-states in the 19th and early 20th centuries. However, the legacy of centuries of Ottoman rule remained deeply embedded in the cultural fabric, architecture, and even the culinary traditions of these nations. Mosques, bridges, and markets built during the Ottoman era still stand as silent witnesses to that long period of shared history. The complex interplay of religious and ethnic identities in the Balkans, often shaped by Ottoman millet system, continued to influence political dynamics long after the empire's departure. Across North Africa, where Ottoman influence had varied in intensity over the centuries, the empire's decline opened the door to increased European colonial expansion. Countries like Egypt, Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia, once nominally or directly under Ottoman suzerainty, fell under British, Italian, and French control. Yet even here, elements of Ottoman administrative practices, legal traditions, and cultural expressions persisted, woven into the tapestry of local life. The cultural legacy of the Ottoman Empire is perhaps its most pervasive and subtle. Ottoman architecture, with its grand mosques, elegant bridges, and intricate tilework, continues to adorn cities from Sarajevo to Jerusalem, from Cairo to Bursa. The distinctive domes and minarets, the caravanserai and hammams, all speak of a shared aesthetic and engineering prowess. Ottoman cuisine, a rich fusion of Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and Balkan influences, has left an indelible mark on the culinary traditions of countless nations. From baklava to kebabs, many dishes enjoyed today trace their origins back to the imperial kitchens of Topkapi Palace. The political legacy is equally complex. The very concept of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, even one that faced challenges and criticisms, offered a historical alternative to the nation-state model that became dominant in the 20th century. Historians still debate the extent to which the Ottoman millet system, which granted religious communities a degree of autonomy, fostered coexistence or inadvertently reinforced divisions. Some scholars argue that it was a pragmatic solution for managing diversity in a pre-modern era, while others contend it ultimately hindered the development of a unified civic identity. The empire's approach to governance, its legal codes, and its bureaucratic structures influenced successor states in various ways, sometimes through direct adoption, sometimes through reaction and rejection. The memory of the Ottoman Empire, like a vast river, flows through the collective consciousness of many nations, sometimes a source of pride and nostalgia, at other times a reminder of past grievances and conflicts. Its story, spanning over 6 centuries, is a testament to the rise and fall of empires, the enduring power of human ambition, and the constant ebb and flow of history. The empire's reach, once extending from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the deserts of North Africa to the plains of Ukraine, left an imprint that continues to shape the world long after its formal dissolution. The echoes of its call to prayer, the whispers of its sultans, and the rustle of its silken banners still seem to linger in the air, carried on the winds of time.